So thanks everyone for being here. Welcome to the new season of I3 for this important webinar discussing disaster preparation strategies for IVF labs. I first-handedly know how important this is, having experienced a few natural disasters in my labs. And during this session, we'll cover key topics like emergency planning, risk assessment, contingency protocols, and budgeting for preventative measures. You'll hear real-world case studies and lessons learned from clinics impacted by catastrophic events. You'll see practical steps to safeguard embryos, gametes, and equipment in case of accidents, system failures, or natural disasters. Proper disaster preparedness is essential for any IVF lab to minimize risk and ensure continuity of operations. Sit back and relax for this valuable discussion to learn how your clinic can always be ready for the unexpected. And in this session, I'm joined by my co-hosts, highly experienced embryologist, Dr. Fadi Choucair and Tricia Adams. Fadi is the scientific manager at Sidra Medicine in Qatar and chair of the embryology special interest group at the Middle East Fertility Society. And my good friend at Ovation, Tricia, is a laboratory manager with Ovation Fertility in Central Louisiana.
Thank you for the intro. Dr. Chelsey Leisinger had a strong grounding to veterinary medicine before joining Ovation Fertility, where she is currently a laboratory director and oversees 4 laboratories. She's also an adjunct faculty member in the Department of Veterinary Clinical Sciences at the LSU School of Veterinary Medicine, where she assists in the education of graduate students and the operation of an ART lab for domestic animals. So we will keep the bios short to get as much out of the webinar, but you will find this and all the I3 webinars on the ivfmeeting.com. Remember, certificates are posted in a few days, not immediate. Tonight, we ask to place all your questions in the Q&A section and not on the chat section. Please take part in the discussions.
All right, I think we'll begin. Our first speaker is Natalie Hesketh. Natalie has had over 20 years experience in the IVF industry. She has worked at multiple centers across Australia in roles ranging from team leader, laboratory manager, clinical trials coordinator, and principal scientist. Natalie's current role is Fertility Laboratories Director for the Genea-wide group. She is responsible for compliance, QA, development, and implementation of novel technologies and science into the Genea laboratories to ensure the best success rates for patients. Natalie.
Thank you for that introduction, and a very early good morning from Melbourne, Australia. It's about 6 a.m. here, so thank you to all my colleagues and peers over in Australia that's joined an early session. So as discussed, I'm going to talk a little bit about lessons learned from some of the emergencies and disaster scenarios that we've had across our laboratories, and I guess also from people that have shared their stories with me. This is not going to be everything about me providing answers for you. It's going to be really about what we've learned and a series of questions that you can take back to your labs and start discussions about, are you prepared with your lab if a disaster scenario was to occur? So I've got no disclosures or conflicts of interest. So, as mentioned, the aim today is to understand the responsibilities of the most important person, which is that on-call person, the person who has that phone and can respond to those emergencies, because as we know, it's late at night when you usually get that phone call. I want you to understand the different scenarios that might occur in the lab and how to respond to them, and ensure that your lab has access to the emergency response material if needed. So over the years, Genea has had its fair share of disaster scenarios and close calls. We, being in Australia, we've got large bushfires that occur. One in particular about 3 years ago. Lots of smoke that infiltrated our laboratories and how to deal with that. power failures with generators not kicking in, IT systems failure, UPS fires and UPS failures, alarm alert failures, gas alarm triggers, liquid nitrogen alarm triggers, and of course, who can forget COVID? There's a few more that at the moment we have not had, and I do not want to have them. One being the biggest one, I think, which is the cryo storage tank failure, a gas line blowout, or a natural disaster which causes power outages and delays for days on end. So I'm going to talk first of all about the most important person in the lab, and that's that person that's on call. So obviously all labs should have an alarm system in place that notifies a lab person if there's a deviation from expected norms. And all your key and critical equipment should be monitored 24/7, 365 days a year if you have tanks or you don't do a shutdown. So one of the questions we've asked ourselves is, what does being on call really mean? What does it mean for your lab staff and personnel? And, I come from, a background of quite a number of years in embryology, and it used to be that we used to have a box of emergency gas regulators and all sorts of equipment, and I think that it's really changed the tune. It's not really about trying to do complex fixes at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's really about identifying the problem and minimizing the risk in the short term. So whilst we expect that, we also need to be able to provide some basic training and set the expectations with our staff. And do remember that the safety of staff should always be put above the safety of the embryos. So you also need to ensure a robust safety and security for staff attending on site. As I mentioned, it's often late at night. So what does your lab use? Do you have a mobile security person to escort them to and from the building? Do you have personal distress alarms? Do you have 2 staff attending? So that's a question for you to take back and make sure that you're keeping your staff safe, and you also understand what it means to be on call. Gas leak or line blowout. I guess the first thing you'll know about is if the gas drops in the incubators and you get an alert. Are your gas bottles actually monitored for changeover? Do you have a dual lever system which moves to the next gas bottle if one side runs out? Do you know how long it takes for your embryos in your incubators and your culture system to begin to change in pH levels and the gas be able to drop and the temperature drops? It is drop size and oil volume dependent. It's something that is a really good thing to practice and have a look at to see how long do you really have if you lose gas. Do you have all your safety equipment, your oxygen level readouts on the outside of your labs? If there's a gas leak and your alarms are going off, obviously the first thing you do is not enter the building. Do you have portable O2 sensors? We've had a couple of instances where our O2 sensors have gone into fault. And unfortunately, one of the labs didn't have an outside readout. So although the oxygen level was still at 18 to 20%, the alarm was going off and we didn't have any idea. So we had to pay the cost of the fire, a hazmat team to come out with gas masks and everything just to find out it was a faulty sensor. So that brings me to maintenance. Do you have a rigorous maintenance schedule for your gas manifolds and gas detection kits? Obviously, as I mentioned, there's no expectation these days, certainly in our labs, to be able to perform complex fixes to gas lines, in the morning. That's what the professionals are for. So the aim is really to reduce the risk of the embryos. So moving them to an alternate source, from your trimix incubators to a CO2 incubator. One question I did have was, if you were lacking in CO2, can you put the embryos in a plastic bag and blow in and out of the plastic bag to increase the CO2 environment and decrease the oxygen? But I think someone shared with me that the carbon monoxide would be actually detrimental to the embryos. Fire and bushfire. Now, this is something that Janae knows quite a fair bit about. There's not much you can control about this, but you can practice your emergency drills. You can also learn from things. What happens when fire alarms go off? Do you have the time? Do you have a protocol of what to do if you're in the middle of different procedures? You know, obviously safety is first. Get out. Again, human lives are far more important than embryos. Fire will often result in a domino effect. So if there is a building fire, it will result in systems failure, power outages, gas lines compromised, electrical fires from the water. And what we found, we had a large fire at Janaea. We had rented out or subleased a space in one of our floors in a high-rise building, and unfortunately that sublease didn't have proper air conditioning in their server room, and they also stored boxes of files in their server room as well, and that resulted in quite a catastrophic fire for us. And what we actually found is that the smoke and the water damage was far more detrimental than the actual flames themselves. We've also seen that VOCs, there's been studies on high temperature bushfires and understanding what happens and what VOCs are released, and that high temperature bushfires changes the chemical makeup of the bushfire smoke, and it's far more dangerous, the VOCs and chemicals that are released. So make sure that you've got your adequate ventilation. Do you have coda towers? Have you got the right number of coda towers for your floor space? And understand that smoke damage can be acidic, which can corrode metal as well. So I've got a picture of the fire at Janaea that we had. That's the source of the fire, so the server room and the actual outside of the server room. So as I mentioned, this resulted in the fire sprinklers going off and huge amounts of flooding throughout the building. But what we didn't really account for is the smoke from a industrial fire, as I mentioned, is acidic. It attaches itself to every single piece of metal and it starts to slowly corrode. So although we believed that we had properly fixed and cleaned up everything, we actually had to strip all the wiring back in all the ceilings across high-rise buildings to replace every single bit of metal wiring. So yeah, that was pretty awful. System outages. Obviously, that's going to affect things like your databases, meaning your theatre lists, your processes, access to SOPs, your contact information, sometimes your phones and computers, and alarm monitoring system. So it depends on how it's all set up. Do you have backup of your servers on a daily basis? Can you revert to paper if required? Can other departments that you liaise with revert to paper? How are you going to contact each other? UPS and the generator power to servers is also could be compromised. And obviously understand the difference between a controlled and uncontrolled shutdown of systems. When you have a system outage and things like servers go offline immediately without a controlled shutdown, it's quite a lengthy process to actually start them back up again. Tank failure. This is the big one that I think keeps many of us awake at night. Thankfully, you know, we haven't had this, but it would be really great to hear of anyone else's experience in the Q&A section around tank failure. Do you have enough space for emergency backup storage? Are you properly insured for tank failure as well? I think that's one of the big ticket items at the moment for insurance companies. Are your tanks appropriately alarmed and monitored? And your insurance probably would be contingent on this. What monitoring do you do? Do you do temperature, liquid level? Some people are moving to infrared temperature monitoring as well. Do you know how long you have depending on the size and type of tank and the contents in your tank? And do you have a policy in place for tank ages and maintenance of your tanks? power and generator failure. This is something that we're familiar with as well. We first of all need to understand our emergency systems. What is your generator and UPS? What's the service history? What's your runtime? If you go onto UPS or generator power, what's your maximum load? Are your systems configured correctly to ensure continuous power supply? And I'll show you a diagram that we draw up across all of our labs to ensure that we understand and know how our power systems work. Well, you've got to understand as well that generators only kick in if there's a disruption to the mains power supply. What about if you have an internal circuit trip? How will you know and how you rectify that problem? As I mentioned, having a map to clearly understand your power systems. Do you have the correct alert set up from monitoring system to understand if you're running off the UPS or generator power? What about other things that might be affected? If you are running off generator power, do your electronic doors still work? Do your alarm systems still work? And what notifications will you get? So one of the examples we had a UPS battery fire. So we had, and a UPS failure. So we learnt the hard way that we actually had a single line going in from mains power, generator, and through to UPS, which then supplied equipment. But what that meant is when our UPS failed or caught fire, it actually halted all power supply through to the essential equipment. And so that power supply ceased. So we reconfigured all of our emergency systems in all labs to ensure that the UPS power and mains power supply is the highest level of supply, and it's monitored centrally and is standardized now. So the next slide is a map of what we map out in every single one of our laboratories. And you can see in a section here, we've got a dual line coming into our UPS feed and we've got ATS switches, which basically means it alerts us when we're on UPS or when we're on generator power. And this is essential to ensure that if there is something wrong with the UPS itself, that it actually can bypass the UPS and continue to feed a mains power to the essential equipment as well. So what can we do? Well, one of the most important things for us is doing mock drills. So each year across our JENEA labs, generally in our slow period, which is over our summer break, we perform a hands-on drill to ensure there's an element of muscle memory, because there's nothing worse than responding to an emergency and not knowing whether actually you can do anything about it. So one of the things we do is, we turn off the lights and power to microscopes. We use hand torches and head torches, and we prepare dishes and actually vitrify, the little blue beads, and we give that a go. We also make sure that we understand how our doors work, and we check our alarm systems and phone systems as well. And we also have a period of time in most of our labs where we have a generator test and power outage. So we do have to work from a full paperwork and ensure our systems are working for us. And we also make sure that we've got, we're able to have enough room, and we work out a strategy for movement of canisters to make sure we've got enough space, and we know everyone's roles and jobs if a tank should fail. We've also put together an emergency kit, and that includes a lot of the key information that you'll need in the case of emergency. So as I mentioned before, head torches and handheld torches. Most labs don't have natural light coming in, and you'd be surprised how dark it is. Obviously batteries, sterile water, plastic drop sheets. They've come in handy a couple of times when there's been ceiling leaks, and we've had to cover up some key equipment. Extension cords, if there's a internal circuit that trips and you need to provide power. Obviously, emergency numbers for all your maintenance and essential equipment, such as power, generator, and UPS. Pens and papers come in handy. Earplugs. We've had situations where we've got hundreds of alarms going off and you just cannot think to work through what you need to do next. And all that essential information, your SOPs for how to vitrify. When people are in panic mode, they find it very difficult to actually think about what's next, and the protocol just goes out of their head. And of course, anything else that you can think of that might help you in that emergency situation. So some of the take-home points is, this is a three-pronged approach. So first of all, risk mitigation. We do not want these disasters to happen in the first place. So put measures in place to avoid them from happening, such as observing safe working practices and that maintenance of critical equipment. Continually review and update your lab disaster plans to ensure it's understood the expectations in the event of a disaster. Obviously, there are things that you have no control over, but it's how we react to those events that matters. And it's not just about the lab. Have clinic-wide plans to address what to do in the event of a disaster. Generally, labs will have enough on their plate thinking about their section, but all good teams, everyone needs to work together in a time of crisis. So some of those short-term discussions that you need to have is who's going to make the decisions and who's going to communicate regarding things like cancellation of cycles, moving of cycles, moving of equipment, contacting patients, and working with alternate clinics. And in the long term, and I think there's another discussion about this, is a business continuity, the insurance and the write-offs, and ensuring that you've got enough cash flow. Because when we had that fire and we had to shut down and move buildings, the immediate cash flow became quite a problem to access all of the additional cash required. And also understanding the impact that it's going to have on patients. So we had a fire, and we, obviously the first thing we do is look through our results over that period of the fire, and we didn't see any deviation in our results whatsoever. But of course, patients aren't going to see that. They're going to say, well, I didn't get pregnant because of the fire. So the expectation was to provide some sort of compensation for patients because that's what they believed. So what to do next? So have discussions every year and involve all your lab staff. Add to your disaster planning documents all the time, and learn from those mistakes that you've made or near misses. Perform those mock drills so staff know what is achievable. Every time you have a close call, ask yourself, well, what can we learn from this? Supply a list of emergency numbers to call, and make sure staff have a screenshot or a photo on their phone and it's printed out and available in your emergency kit. And as I said, create that emergency kit as well. You might never use it, but be thankful that you have it. Thank you so much. And I will pass over to the moderators for any questions.
Thank you, Natalie, for this insightful presentation. One quick question. You mentioned that the most important person is the staff. So do you have a lone worker protocol? So when someone is working by themselves alone in the lab, what's your thought?
Yes, it's something that is very we've toyed back and forth, because we have some of the quite small labs where it's not financially able to actually send two people at 2 o'clock in the morning to the lab, and you don't want to wake up two people to respond to what might be a faulty alarm on a cryo tank or something. So we, depending on the lab size and the location, we have a range of different protocols. So as I mentioned, in some buildings we have security staff that will escort and wait for that person, and if that person doesn't come out within half an hour, or check in with them, then they raise the alarm. We have some labs with personal security alarms, and some of our bigger labs, we obviously have 2 people that attend at all times to ensure the safety of the staff, especially in, you know, some of those critical work environments, such as possibly, you know, low oxygen environments and things like that.
Thank you, Natalie. So stay with us till the end for the discussion. So now we're going to move to our next speaker, Dr. Kristen Ivani. Kristen served as the laboratory IVF laboratory director at the Reproductive Science Center at the San Francisco Bay Area in San Ramon, California for over 30 years, before recently turning over the reins and being promoted to part-time embryologist and consultant. In her free time, she enjoys sharing her love of embryology, studying the legal and ethical aspects of ART, and doing anything outdoors. She also enjoys her other director job as a volunteer camp director at two Sentinel Girl Scout camp, which has provided backpacking experiences in the Sierra Nevada mountains for over 80 years. Dr. Kristen will present about developing of an emergency and business continuity plan for in vitro fertilization clinics. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Fadi, and thank you to Giles and the entire I3 team for this invitation and the opportunity to discuss this topic that keeps us all up at night. Natalie did an amazing job, and as Natalie said, I'm not going to be able to give you a step-by-step guide to provide a plan for your lab, but rather tools that you can use, resources that you can look at that will help you develop plans for your own laboratories. So why do we need an emergency plan? If you look at the ASRM and ESHRI guidelines, there are 3 goals of our plans, regardless of the size of our programs. Number 1 is the safety of the program personnel and the patients. Number 2 is safety and preservation of fresh and cryopreserved human tissues. And number 3, finally, the protection and security of our records, financial and operational documents, equipment, etc. So where do we even start? The first step is to perform a risk assessment for your specific area. If you live in an area where you're never going to have a hurricane, you probably don't need to worry too much about hurricane prep. But look at what you're at risk for in your specific area. And we're going to talk in a minute about the different types of disasters that you might encounter. Do a business impact analysis. There's nothing that'll scare your leadership team more than looking at what might happen if we're not prepared for a disaster. It's important to evaluate the risk of evacuating the premises versus the risk of potential damage to the premises. It might be worse for you to try and evacuate everything than to try and ride it out. But then the next step is really the most important thing that you all need to decide is what event will trigger your action plan? When do you decide to act? And a service recovery plan is important. What are we going to do after the disaster? And finally, what did we learn and how can we improve to avoid types of situations in the future? So we're all aware of different types of disasters. We've got natural disasters, human-caused disasters, technological, hazardous materials, and chain interruption. And we're going to see a film a little bit later in the webinar today about different programs that have experienced all different types of disasters. And you know, what we used to think of a risk of a natural disaster is very different now in 2023 than it was even 10 years ago. With climate change, we've got bigger wildfires, stronger hurricanes, less time to prepare and react to these types of situations. And so it makes our preparation even more important. Some of you have been involved in disaster relief after bomb threats, terrorism. We've all been exposed to the pandemic. We're at risk for lost and corrupt data, loss of connectivity. There may be a chemical spill or a natural gas leak that requires evacuation. And then finally, transportation interruptions, supply chain failures, which again, many of us experienced during COVID, during the pandemic, but it can happen during any of these types of disasters. And I think that's one of the things we need to be most prepared for, is how are we going to get the supplies that we need? So when looking at a business impact analysis, we've got to consider our potential for lost and or delayed cycles as well as income. We're probably going to be looking at increased expenses, employee overtime. We may need to outsource procedures, or we may need to bring in staff. There's a likelihood that we're going to be paying for higher costs to expedite things. Well, I need my liquid nitrogen now. We need our medications now. And that all costs extra money. We may lose contracts, insurance contracts or business contracts as a result of a disaster. We need to look at the short versus the extended disruption. So a power outage of a few hours may have no impact, but a power outage of a few weeks can have significant impact to the practice. We need to look at what processes and resources are needed to function at different levels. Can we get away with only one embryo transfer room? Can we send our retrievals to a nearby hospital or surgery center? This is one of the most important times when you can bring your whole team in, because they're going to understand, maybe your financial team understands one aspect, your operations team, your surgical team. Bring those people into these discussions. This should not just be the laboratory trying to figure out what's going to happen in the laboratory. This is really a clinic-wide or even a company-wide operation, and it's an excellent opportunity to utilize all the teams that we have. One of the biggest questions, should I stay or should I go now? And I realize the little record in there ages me a bit, but hopefully some of you are familiar with that song. So again, evaluate the risk of evacuating your facility versus the risk of damage. This is something I think people in hurricane-prone or wildfire-prone areas are faced with on a fairly regular basis. Well, it's probably not going to get here in this amount of time, or I'm going to have time to get out. What event is going to trigger the action plan? When do you decide to act? And who is responsible for making that decision? Is it the practice manager? Is it the medical director, the laboratory director? Is it a corporate person? Understand who is going to initiate the disaster plan for you. So let's assume you have a little bit of time here. And many of you have been through this type of situation with an impending potential disaster, especially of the weather type. But what to do with your cryotanks and liquid nitrogen? Most important thing is to attempt to maintain a stable laboratory environment, but still be prepared for the worst. Have extra liquid nitrogen on hand. If you can, move your tanks to a safer location if it's possible or if it's necessary. And I think one of the things that patients don't understand, especially nowadays, is that our responsibility is to get the live humans out to safety, and that we may not be able to save the embryos and sperm and frozen oocytes that are in our facilities. If necessary, you can cancel biopsy procedures, you can cancel shipping and receiving. Keep these things in mind as a method to preserve the liquid nitrogen that you have and minimize the number of times that you're opening and closing your cryotanks. This is really important statement that your cryopreservation consent should include a statement so that the patients understand that the clinic is going to make reasonable efforts to protect the tissue. However, the clinic will not be responsible for the loss of viability due to a situation beyond its control. And the patients should also be aware that your clinic may need to move the tissue to a safer location until the emergency situation ends. That may be another clinic, it may be a long-term storage facility. I know one clinic during a fire moved tanks to somebody's garage. I mean, they needed to get them out of the clinic. And patients need to know that we're going to do the very best we can, but we may not be able to do everything they expect us to do. So what about the fresh and frozen eggs and embryos that we have in the clinic, either during a disaster or an approaching disaster? And, you know, many of you on this call may remember where we didn't have the luxury of vitrification. And now we're really in a situation where we can pretty much freeze at any stage. So that's always a solution. What if the patient's about to have an egg retrieval? You know, do you move forward with the egg retrieval? You can cancel the retrieval, or you can redirect to another facility. If the retrieval's already done, but we can freeze oocytes, we can freeze 2PNs, day 2, day 3, day 4, all the way up. Fresh transfers can be scheduled canceled, and we can freeze all the embryos. Biopsies can be canceled. We can freeze the embryos and then subsequently thaw and biopsy those embryos at a later date. I know programs that have been looking, you know, staring a hurricane down the street and just freeze, and then they get out. That's the best they can do. But that's such a great option now where we didn't have that before. I mean, eggs had to be discarded. You know, embryo freezing programs took a long time. They required power, and now we've got this this option that makes this such a safer opportunity for our patients. So some of the really important considerations for your plan, and Natalie touched on some of these, staff communication is so important. You should have at least 2 methods of contact for each person, including a personal email. And a landline. Not many people have landlines anymore if they rely only on a cell phone. But you can also use social media because you can get mass information out. People are still looking on social media. They're checking in on social media. Designate who's at the top of the phone tree. It's a great idea to have a designated number where staff can leave a voicemail to let you know that they're okay, that they can come in, that they can't come in. That is, you know, stops a lot of the questioning about wondering if someone's okay or where they are. Test the phone tree regularly and keep it up to date. Everyone should have a copy of the phone tree on their cell phone so they know who's next on the phone tree and what to do. People should know their role during an emergency. And as Natalie mentioned, you know, practice, practice, practice. This develops muscle memory. It commits the plan to memory so people know what to do and they're not as panicked. Some other important considerations. Do your local authorities know that human specimens are stored on site? Whether or not they're going to be able to help us in an emergency is questionable, but at least if they know, yes, this liquid nitrogen truck needs to get through here. Don't stop them, don't question them. They may be able to provide a short-term storage situation for us if our building is not usable. But, you know, for example, in our clinic in San Ramon, when the fire inspector comes, they are made aware. It has to be labeled on the door. All the tanks are labeled, so they know that there's human specimens stored on site. Please, please set up an arrangement with another local clinic and keep that current and keep it reciprocal. I'll help you if you help me, but also understand and be respectful that a situation may change for them where they're not able to help you or you're not able to help them. But keep that current, and how would that work? Natalie had a nice slide on emergency kits. I would also add food to that in case your staff are held at the clinic for an extended period of time. Food, water, extension cord, flashlights, batteries, etc. Do you have fuel for the generator, and is it accessible? Is the generator accessible and safe from flooding? So if the generator's on the ground and the ground is flooding, it's not going to help you. Likewise, if it's on the roof and you're in the middle of you know, torrential downpour and your generator is damaged, that's not going to help you either. Do you have backup power? And do people know how to use it? Again, this gets back to doing drills, doing practice. Let people know what their role is, how to find emergency supplies, and how to use them. Service recovery. This is really a difficult situation because this is impacting the facility as well as our patients. Is your facility still usable? Or can you use space at another facility? Can you go to a nearby surgery center? Can your patients get to the surgery center if they needed to? Can you share staff with another facility? We have a really tight network of people in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I remember in New York as well that when there's a disaster, people will share staff. The main thing is to take care of the patients after the safety of our staff, of course. Do you have backup suppliers for your key equipment and supplies and things like liquid nitrogen? If your liquid nitrogen supplier is not available, do you have another company that you can call that can get liquid nitrogen to you sooner? So think about, what do I need to be able to do my job and to be able to take care of patients after the disaster happens? And FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the United States, has a great website, and I hope that you'll go look at it. They have these 3 key parts: prepare now, how do I survive during this, and how am I safe after this? And they've got a list of everything from avalanches to bomb threats to hurricanes to wildfires. And they've got all these 3 steps specified for each of the potential disasters, including power outages and things like that, active shooters. So take a look at their website, and I'm sure will be able to find some tidbits to use for your plan. I want to introduce you to this tool. This is called an after action review. And this was developed by the United States Army in the 70s as a tool to provide feedback for units after collective training exercises. And it's a 4-step process after something happens. And step 1, what was supposed to happen. Step 2, what actually happened. Step 3, why was there a difference? And step 4, what can we learn from this? And the purpose of an after action review is to identify our best practices, figure out where our knowledge gaps are, and what lessons can we learn from this process. It also allows us to identify immediate as well as long-term corrective actions for future responses. And this allows us to learn from an actual experience that happened to us, rather than trying to guess what might happen if this thing might happen to us. So I would encourage you to, use these disasters and go through these 4 steps as an opportunity to learn what we can do better in the future. One of the things we often overlook is what happens to our patients. So we do get really caught up, as we should, in the safety of our staff. And then number 2 is our cryopreserved tissue. And then number 3 is our facility. But what about our patients? Your patients are sitting at home watching this on the news, and they're wondering, is it safe for me to stop my treatment? I'm on day 7 of stimulation, and now I can't have my retrieval. Is this safe? I'm worried about my eggs, my sperm, and my embryos, whether they're fresh or they're frozen. How am I going to talk to my treatment team? How am I going to hear from them? How will I know what to do next? This next step, I think we really need to be patient, really need to be sensitive as to how patients might be affected by the disaster. They might be questioning their financial stability. If they had to evacuate, they might be uprooted from their homes. If their community was destroyed, for example, in Hurricane Katrina, where entire neighborhoods were destroyed, their whole social network may be gone as well. It's also really important to think about, if they've lost power, can they keep their medications cold? Can they even get to the store to pick up their medications? If possible, think about communicating with patients during a disaster using social media. Oftentimes they look at your Facebook page or your Twitter or your Instagram, and you can communicate things to the patients on social media. If possible, get those Zoom connections set back up. So we don't want to forget about how our patients are feeling through these disasters. And I wanted to provide you with a list of resources. All of these are free websites you can go on to. You can find all kinds of information on developing your plan, specific situations. For example, the American Red Cross has disaster maps for different parts of the world to what you might be more susceptible to. So I would encourage you to go on and look at these websites, and I'm certain that you'll be able to find information that'll be helpful for you. Thank you, and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for such an interesting presentation. So, of course, emergency and disaster information is abundant. You can get lost in it. So, if you have a clinic that maybe you haven't had meetings in a while, maybe it's not at the forefront of everyone's mind, what method do you recommend to get everyone involved in the clinic before an event occurs? I mean, a disaster meeting? Do you get teams together to put together emergency binders? What would you suggest?
I think that's a great question, and there are some people who obviously take this a lot more seriously than others. But I think what we're going to see here in a little bit is a video about what some of our colleagues have been through. And if that video is available, I think that's a great place to start, because it'll scare people into realizing how important this is. So I think, getting resources together and understanding what we might be at risk for in our clinic, and then bringing it to the leadership teams in our practices. This is also an opportunity. Many of us are part of a larger fertility network now, and this can be a network-wide operation. It can be done even within your local groups. I know that there's embryology groups in many parts of the U.S. and outside of the U.S., and I think the most important thing is to bring the attention to the leadership team.
Thank you. So we'll move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker, Stephen Katz MD, has focused his career solely on advanced reproductive care since 1995. In developing IVF programs over 20-odd years, he came to realize the lack of appropriate medical malpractice risk management and claims prevention and management in the REI practice environment. Dr. Katz has now dedicated his professional life to creating REI Protect, LLC. REI Protect is the only risk management and medical professional liability program fully dedicated to REI practices and IVF laboratories in the U.S. All right, Dr. Katz.
Well, Tricia, thank you for the kind introduction, and I'm honored to add a few thoughts today to this important topic, and so far this great presentation. I'd like to specifically really focus on what does insurance coverage look like in our space for natural disasters. Let's split it up a little bit first. There's really two types of coverage that are related. One would be professional liability coverage, coverage for acts of professional negligence. They could be an embryologist dropping eggs in the laboratory. They could be a mislabeling event. It could be loss of an embryo under the microscope. All of these really focus on professional negligence, and coverage would be professional liability coverage, which I'm hoping everybody is familiar with. The other type of coverage, which is broader and more complex, is general liability coverage. And general liability coverage really spans most of our society. The difficulty we have with general liability coverage in the REI space is becoming more pronounced. And why? General liability really focuses on what is the value of the loss. So if you have general liability coverage or a homeowner's coverage, say for your home can be valued and you can buy policy coverage on that value. Same for an automobile. The problem we have in the IVF lab is we don't know how to value the cryo-stored embryos, eggs, or sperm. And it's been a big contention and a big hurdle for general liability companies particularly in the United States, to really focus on how to prepare a policy, given that they're not comfortable really valuing the loss. And so it's very difficult to get general liability coverage in the US just on IVF labs because of what we do. Let's add another layer of complexity through natural disasters. Hurricane, tornado, wildfire. I think it's almost impossible. I don't want to say impossible, but I would say almost impossible to get coverage for your important items or tissues in your IVF lab, given those occurrences. And so it becomes even more important to really follow, the presentation of Natalie and Dr. Ivani on being prepared. I don't think you'll find, at least in the United States, coverage for those losses on natural disasters. So preparedness becomes even more important. And so I sit here, as a student of Natalie and Dr. Ivani and listening, I thought their presentations really on risk were phenomenal. I'd like to break down 3 special situations, and we can talk about more of this on Q&A. But let's talk a little bit about tank coverage, because I think that's on the forefront of everybody's mind. There's 2 separate issues on tank coverage. The first, of course, is coverage on the tank itself, the manufactured, the physical tank. And that type of coverage would be called products liability coverage. And the manufacturer has to hold that type of coverage. It's not unreasonable for you to ask your tank manufacturer, where do they hold their products liability coverage? Because if the tank fails, albeit that's very rare, that's the coverage that would have to be provided. Now, tanks rarely fail, or in a tank failure, I think it would be a very unique time for 100% of the fault to fall on the tank. We're all professionals and experts, and as both Natalie and Dr. Ivani pointed out, the embryology laboratory team is very focused on the health, safety, and welfare of the tank and the tissues in the tank. We're all in and out of the lab constantly. We have alarm systems. And so attention from the professional staff to the tanks is of utmost importance. I don't want to say all tank failures, but the vast majority of tank failures have had some component of professional negligence, professional liability. I don't think you're going to find the normal carrier covering professional liability on the tank contents. It's not their expertise. It just wouldn't be sensible for them to cover that, because I don't think they would have the knowledge to really understand what they're covering. We, of course, provide that coverage because that is our expertise. But in your thinking, there's 2 types of coverage: products coverage on the tank itself and professional liability coverage on the acts of the professionals taking care of the tanks. So all of your labs in any country across the globe should have professional liability coverage on the tanks. I think that's extremely valuable. The second piece I wanted to point out before we go to Q&A is consents. I think Natalie and Dr. Ivani really did a good job talking about consents. Modern consents have to have a paragraph or 2 that specifically talk about the risk of a natural disaster. It has to be spelled out very clearly, giving informed consent about what your reactions, what the professional staff reactions would be to a fire or a flood or something along those lines, moving embryos out of the lab, taking precautionary measures. I think that verbiage should be in all of your consents, and I think that would be very helpful. The last thing I really wasn't expecting to talk about too much, but Natalie brought up an incredible concept, and that is what's called loss of business income. So following a catastrophe, the lab is going to be inoperable. And so for a period of time, you will not have income at the same level that budget projections were placed. So you can buy insurance policies for loss of business income. And I think that would be a very valuable adjunct to your policy package because it makes sense. I mean, without cash flow and a business stream of income, recovering from a natural disaster would just be far more complicated. So I am very happy to answer any and all questions on the Q&A session, and I'm honored that I could share a few thoughts to such a distinguished faculty today. And obviously, this concept is near and dear to my heart from a risk management point of view. So, Tricia, thank you for introducing me, and nice to be here, you all.
Thank you, Dr. Katz, for this insightful discussion. One question, would the insurance company look at your emergency policies and perhaps have a lower premium?
The answer would be yes. I say that with a little caveat because the insurance company carrier that you're dealing with has to have enough knowledge to know what they're looking at. But in general, the more emergency policies and procedures that you have, the more confidence the carrier will have with you and the lower your rates would be.
So, thank you, Dr. Katz. Stay with us for the Q&A section. So now our next section before the Q&A is a selection of real-life disaster situations with lab managers and directors, Dr. Hiromitsu Hattori, Dr. Michael Baker, Dr. Bhushan Gangrade, Dr. Ellen Stringfellow, and Dr. Ineabelle Collazo. But first, I want to take a moment to share with you our experience in Beirut, Lebanon, after the catastrophic port explosion in August 2020. I was employed at the American University of Beirut, and our hospital was approximately 4 kilometers away from the site of the explosion. Fortunately, the lab was positioned in the heart of the hospital, so immediately after the explosion, an on-duty doctor was contacted to physically inspect the lab. Thankfully, it remained untouched, and the monitoring system showed no alarms. Simultaneously, another nearby hospital in Beirut that was highly affected by the explosion faced severe damage. The ceiling of their lab collapsed and lab doors were damaged. The entire hospital suffered a power outage, leaving them in a state of emergency. They were fortunate that the lab doesn't perform cryopreservation, so there were no cryo tanks and no embryos were in the incubator at that time. So now we're gonna see a selection of real-life disaster situations from around the world.
Hello, my name is Hiromitsu Hattori. I'm laboratory director of Kyono Art Clinic Laboratory in Japan. So today I'd like to talk about what I experienced during the Great East Japan earthquake in 2011. I'm sorry, but I'm speaking in Japanese. So
the earthquake happened in 2011. It was March. It was 2:46 p.m. and the lab was underway with all the work of the day. They were preparing for the embryo transfers. It was early afternoon, so most of the jobs were done of that day, and they fortunately didn't lose any eggs or embryos during the earthquake when it was happening.
My name is Ineabelle Collazo. I am the embryology lab director for the IVF labs in IVF MD, Florida. We have 4 IVF labs in 4 different counties. One of the things that affect the most this area is the hurricanes. So when we are in hurricane season, we're in constant alert.
My name is BK Gangrade, Bhushan Gangrade, and I am located in Central Florida, United States, especially particularly in Orlando area. Over last 30 years that I have been here, we have seen about 5 or 6 major hurricanes in Central Florida area. That averages about every 4 or 5 years we see one hurricane that comes ashore. And as you all know, some of these natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, there's nothing that we can do to prevent, but of course we can take precautions to mitigate and reduce the risk.
My name is Ellen Stringfellow. I am the client and corporate education lead at Tomorrow Life Sciences, located in New York City. Living in Birmingham, Alabama for my career, we are typically faced with a lot of spring and fall tornadoes when the weather tends to change. When there's a cold front and a warm front that collide, it becomes very stormy, and these tornadoes can pop up very quickly and become quite destructive. The main thing that this affects is power outages, which we all know are not our friend in the laboratory.
So my name is Natalia Makchzoumi. I'm the lab director here at Barbados Fertility Center. I've been working here since 2012. And here we are quite a small clinic. We do reach up to 400 cycles a year approximately. And we are 4 laboratory staff members that we are full-time employed here. Here in the Caribbean, the most prominent threat is really hurricanes. So the hurricane season is supposedly between June 1st and November 30th. This is something that we are prepared for every year. So here in the clinic, we do have an SOP that outlines everything that we need to do in case of an emergency. That includes everything, mostly hurricanes, but that includes fire or any sort of civil unrest. So we have an SOP specifically for that. And every year, just before hurricane season starts, our operations manager just points out that we have to review that SOP, just read it, be familiar with it, and make sure that we know what we are expected to do if a hurricane hits Barbados.
The initial earthquake, the duration of the shakes was about 5 to 6 minutes, and they had to hold on to each other. So there was no chance that they could hold on to the incubators or any of the equipment which was in the lab. The magnitude of the earthquake was magnitude 9 on the Richter scale and happened about 100 kilometers further away from where the clinic was situated. The focus of the earthquake was about 30 kilometers below the seafloor in the West Pacific Ocean. As you probably know, a massive tsunami ensued, and it was the cause of the most of the death from this natural disaster, where it is believed at least 20,000 people lost their lives. Luckily, the clinic was far inland, so the tsunami did not have a great effect. But what did have the effect was the massive power outages.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Baker. I'm the laboratory director at Aspire Fertility San Antonio, Aspire Fertility Dallas, and Pacific Fertility Center in San Francisco. Can't say that I've experienced many natural disasters at this point. My time in Florida, we were always on guard for hurricane preparedness. But I have to say some of my personal experiences touch closest on electrical backup planning, not even just generator backups, but what to do when your circuits in the embryology laboratory fail for any number of reasons. We all plan for power outages, whether it's construction nearby or bad electrical storms that will cut power to the city or to the block. But those generators don't always turn on if that power issue is a localized issue to your room, or even just a particular circuit in your laboratory.
We did have a rechargeable generator, so in the first instance, we were using that for all our power uses. After the quake happened, our main focus, of course, was on the clinic staff and patients. All were evacuated safely and none were hurt in the incident. The patients could not be treated, obviously, so they were sent home with instructions that we would contact them. At that time, there was still embryos and eggs still in incubators. We had to check to see that they were all safe and try to freeze them. We were trying to freeze the embryos, but there was many aftershocks after the earthquake, so you can imagine it was very difficult to freeze the samples.
All the things that we thought could not occur, perhaps occurred, like loss of power, and generator having a malfunction in the middle. There was no patients in the incubators. There was nothing that was affected, because that's one of the reasons why we go into we are either going to transfer or freeze. Also, there's nothing on site by the time the hurricane hits.
As we said, we had a generator, but the fuel was limited, so we needed to search and get fuel from a local gas station. We were very lucky that we had diesel fuel, so we could incubate for at least a further day in the lab. The following day at 8 a.m., we arrived to freeze all the samples that were remaining, and we finished early afternoon that same day. There were still power outages going off around the city at that point, but we were able to safely freeze all the samples that day.
In April of 2019, there was a terrific storm that came through and created great damage, widespread throughout the state of Alabama. And this was extremely concerning, because we knew ahead of time that there was going to be a bad storm day. We just did not know how terrible it would be. It was always a joke in my laboratory that I was the weather girl, because I have always been interested in weather pattern changes, and said if I was not an embryologist when I grew up, I would have been a meteorologist.
One of our main concerns, of course, was medical gases, and in particular liquid nitrogen, as we would run out very soon of liquid nitrogen, which was storing the embryos.
Liquid nitrogen supply on site, just in case there's a shortage of it. We prepare that way beforehand. We, as a practice, do not have embryologists on site in the impending hurricane, especially because in Florida you have some surges, as we saw last year with Hurricane Ian. Things can happen in terms of that. We have systems in place where some of our affiliate facilities will take over the tanks if need to out of to another location.
We are pretty much prepared for something happening or coming our way. With global warming, it is getting more and more frequent, and the intensity of the hurricanes is also getting a little stronger now.
Regarding the hurricane, so our SOP includes basically, because for a hurricane, we are prepared. So it's been monitored by government. So we do get the updates where it is, how it's going to affect the island. So we have a description in our SOP, what we're supposed to do 4 days before, 3 days before, so we know exactly our steps. And obviously the most important thing is that we have the list of people that are responsible to give out information and to give out how we're going to proceed before, during, and after, which I think is very important in an emergency. We need to have clear communication. We need to know, where we are addressing our concerns, our question, and who we are getting direction from.
Number one, it's important for us to test everything continuously. Hurricane preparedness is a whole year process. It's not only when the hurricane comes.
When we inquired about liquid nitrogen with the liquid nitrogen companies, they said that medical facilities were going to be a priority, and we were able in 3 or 4 days to get supplies for liquid nitrogen. As far as damage, there was little damage serious in the actual clinic because we had incubators, but they were already bolted to the surfaces, although they did move several centimeters during the quake. Before the earthquake, we kept very little stock, but one of the things we did after the earthquake with our disaster planning was to keep stock for at least 2 weeks of every available item in the lab.
What is causing our incubators to be running on backup battery power? Even though the building has lights, the generator is not on. And so mad dashes resulted to find extension cords capable of reaching functional power outlets. We needed extra surge protectors with power strips to plug in multiple incubators into these extension cords, just for the short term until we could get service techs out to flip the breakers or to resolve the UPS failures.
Tend not to have embryologists on staff, and we don't want to have our patients to be exposed to that after the hurricane.
It's quite certain that first thing what happens during any hurricane is the power loss of power. And we do have generators that can provide power for at least 7 days to the lab.
We don't feel that we have a problem during the hurricane, but the aftermath of a hurricane is the main concern, because you don't know what you may encounter. Electrical cables on the street, areas that are completely flooded, trees that may be obstructing the highways. Of course, they put curfews, like was the case of Hurricane Ian last year. So we may not be able to get to the laboratory, or the patients may not be able to get to the office to seek treatment.
From my experience to you, it is highly recommended to have some of these emergency extension cords on hand to just be able to get that emergency power when your critical outlets fail.
Also, we invested in a second liquid nitrogen holding container so we could have enough liquid nitrogen in any event.
We always make sure we had adequate LN2 backup supplies and medical gas backups. It was also necessary that we had someone from our generator services come out and just verify that our generator was going to be good prior to the bad weather day.
We do test our generators on a weekly basis. So we purposely trigger them, the power, and test the equipment for how long it can run.
If you've got a UPS built into your laboratory, be sure to read up in the user instructions to see if there is a functional testing feature so that you can perform quality control on that UPS on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis, depending on what's recommended from that manufacturer.
Our executive director starts calling meetings, regular meetings, and prepare for this. All team leaders are involved, from clinical team, clinical ops, nursing, laboratory, and we start planning the meeting.
So our SOP includes fire, emergency, as I said, civil unrest, even violation of violence in the workplace, which is also an emergency. So this is all in one document. All staff have access to it, and all staff they have the responsibility of reading through it and are expected to act accordingly.
We now, with vitrification, have the ability to cryopreserve specimens, be it eggs or embryos, at various stages very successfully.
We particularly do not leave embryos in culture during the hurricane. We have never been, in the 30 years that IVFMD has been open, we have never left an embryo in culture during a hurricane.
We try not to keep, no embryos are kept in the incubator. Everything is frozen and moved away.
It is in our policy. So if we see that, the threat is imminent, we will freeze everything.
We just freeze all transfer, and our patients are extremely understanding about that.
Patients are told about it, that hurricane is on its way. We might have to cancel their procedures. They may have to go to another nearby clinics for their further procedures, whether it is retrieval or any other kind of surgical procedure that has to be scheduled here. That is the first thing. All our consents patients have signed here. They always have a paragraph included in that, in the event of any unseen natural disaster, we may have to take different precautions and may have to cancel the procedures or freeze their embryos.
And I always felt it was very important to have a lead from each department to kind of organize the staff in a dangerous weather day situation. It was also important to have someone from the administrative side that would be on top of it for patient safety as well, coming in for egg retrievals, transfers, and things like that.
So it is a newly constructed building, only 5 years old, and it was constructed according to the most recent hurricane preparedness or plans.
Supply chain has been a very, very challenging aspect of our job. It has been always, to be honest, because Barbados is very far and isolated. So that has always been something that we need to plan for. After COVID, it has been especially challenging. So what we try to do is just the beloved stock. So we never leave our supplies to go down.
Before the earthquake, the clinic did do disaster preparedness tests, and we did practice drills in case of an earthquake. But of course, nothing really prepares you for the real thing. We didn't realize until after the actual earthquake happened that training helps. But again, another thing is to witness it in real life. Many other things, such as food and water and contact between people, was very important, and lessons which we learned for the earthquake.
So in looking back over my career, there are constant changes that occur in the form of natural disasters that we always have to be prepared for. And thinking of mentoring young embryologists, the most important thing I can say is to always be forward thinking. Always think of the worst case scenario and hope for the best.
Excellent video montage. I can echo many of the things that were said in that video. I haven't been a lab director all too long, but I have experienced some harrowing events already. Tricia and I went through Hurricane Ida together in 2021, where we were unable to get diesel for our generator, and the lab was shut down from power, so we had to emergently freeze everything. We also couldn't communicate via cell phone for several days. The towers were all down, so it's essential to have, a list of who you know is coming in, and a very, very thorough and detailed SOP. I think we may have added 5 or 8 pages to our emergency SOP after that hurricane. And then just this year, there was a tornado at Grand Rapids, Michigan lab, and everything was going fine until a building down the street from us exploded and they had to turn off our gas to the generator. So it's just really important to be prepared for anything that can happen. But we're going to jump to some Q&A, and I'm going to circle back to Natalie. Question from Philip. After the server fire at your high rise and the cleanup, how did you know it was safe to return to working in the labs?
Good question. Yes. We did a lot of cleanup, so there was a fine ash throughout the whole building and the lab. Luckily, with all our embryos were away, we didn't have time to put the embryos away. It actually occurred on a Sunday, which is probably the best day because we didn't have any patients and we had minimal staff on site. So a big cleanup occurred. We got professional lab cleaners in to do the cleanup. We discarded every single consumable and cleaned from top to bottom. Did VOC readings, so we did happen to have quite a good VOC meter, and basically bought in air scrubbers, more coda towers, more any sort of air cleaner and filtration system possible, and we started back up. Luckily in Sydney where this occurred, we actually had a couple of other labs close by where we diverted all of our patients and procedures to, and obviously didn't proceed with any transfers. So we started up again after a week, after all our VOC meter reading and particle counts indicated it was safe to do so.
Great, thank you. And I'll leave this question open to everybody. What's the best way to move your MVE tanks containing patient samples in the event of emergency? Load them into shippers or roll them on wheels? Anyone want to jump in and answer this one?
When I think about how that was 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when we maybe had 1 or 2 or 3 tanks, but now clinics have 50, 60, 100 of the 4711s and many of the big large tanks. Unfortunately, I don't really think it's realistic that we're going to be able to move those tanks out. I mean, if it's something where you had a lot of notice and you're able to use the elevator, but also remember in the case of a disaster, you're not going to be able to use your elevators. And so you really can't expect your staff to necessarily carry all those downstairs. I think it's one of the harsh realities of the IVF labs that we work in today. It's not like it was many years ago. I think we can only do the best we can do. And if you're in a disaster like the earthquake, they're like in California, and I know somebody commented in Mexico, everything's chained to the walls too because of the earthquakes to keep things from tipping. So unfortunately, I think it's difficult to expect that we're going to be able to move all those tanks out. But I would love to hear what other people have to say.
Kristen, I would think that given the level of storage, even at the local IVF level, that putting them into shippers would not even be a realistic possibility. They'd have to move the tanks themselves, which you're pointing out is very difficult. But I don't think putting them in shippers, unless I'm missing something, even would be applicable. Chelsey, what do you think? I think we got to move the tanks.
Yeah, I agree with Kristen. I'm not sure you'd be able to save all of them. I mean, even in Louisiana, one of our labs is on the 5th floor. So, and we don't have many tanks because we don't do a lot of storage on site, but I'm not sure we'd be able to get them down the stairs safely to get them out. What do you think, Tricia?
No, I don't think so. In fact, I was discussing that with someone the other day, that even to lift one of those tanks, can take multiple people. And if you have multiple tanks and then we're on the 5th floor, I mean, it would be very, very difficult and problematic. And then you run the risk of dropping the tank and spilling the tank and then what happens after that?
And what about accreditations for the lab? So do they check for any vertical evacuation, those plans?
We have evacuation plans, but for the staff, but not really for moving the tanks down the flights of stairs.
So is this a call for safe long-term storage off-site?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we utilize long-term storage mainly for in Louisiana. We do, as Chelsey said, we have limited storage on site.
But how would they evacuate if they were on an upper floor as well, and even larger tanks than we would use? I mean, obviously being on the ground floor is convenient, but many people don't have that luxury, unfortunately.
Well, Kristen, I think you're right, but I'm hoping that long-term storage
But I
facilities
think
ones are in places that are not as prone to hurricanes or floods, things like that. Yeah.
So
oh yeah, I was going to add something similar, that I think it's important also to discuss this. It's not just a lab issue that needs to be you know, worked out. It's a business issue, and they need to know what our plan is from the lab side of things. Is it realistic to be able to actually move these tanks out? Every lab's different, and the personnel that you have, you can evacuate those tanks too as well. So we work through that. And with the tanks.
So I have a question here on our Q&A for Dr. Katz, which sort of fits into what we're discussing now. The question is from Philip Chan, and it says, most of the points covered involve steps to take when a disaster occurs. Would you consider designing and building the IVF lab in anticipation of disasters as an important point? For example, making the new lab fireproof or waterproof, or have a dedicated safe room with thick shielded walls to protect against nuclear EMF attacks. Any thoughts?
Well, I don't know that I'm the most qualified to answer lab construction. I think I should pass it on to the panel. I think I'll do that. Chelsey, you want to grab that, or someone else?
Kristen, you want to jump in on that one? Any thoughts?
Well, I noticed, in the video that BK said that they did that in Florida when they built their new facility. They built it to the highest standard at the time, 5 years ago, which is really the best that we can do. I don't think that we're going to be able to build or anticipate every type of thing that's going to happen. But again, I think it's really assessing the risk in your area and then going with those regulations.
I think that's really the key point maybe of this seminar, is that natural disasters occur, but you have some data on where those disasters would occur. Hurricanes in Florida, Barbados, maybe wildfires in Northern California. And I think, all of this has to be individualized, right? I
agree. And also look at, things that are not natural, things like, nuclear power plants or gas leaks or those kinds of things. So, I think it's really important for people to assess what's really at risk for you in your area, and then go from there. Use that as a starting point.
That's a great point. The non-natural. I think we're all remembering what happened in 2020 when the world shut down from the pandemic. And we all had some difficult, unique challenges associated with, lab operations. We still had tanks that needed monitored, and, how do you staff? Most of the world got shut down to do retrievals for a short period of time. So that's also something to consider.
There's a really great slide presentation out there, and maybe some of you have heard it, Dr. Charlie Borman in Boston. And Boston seems to be a magnet for, bombs and snowstorms and hurricanes, and you name it, they have it. But it's a really elegant presentation on just sort of this after analysis of what did we do right, what did we not do so well, and what can we learn from this. And, Boston is not necessarily, you wouldn't think of it as a place that is affected by hurricanes, but they had the aftermath of hurricane and snowstorms, and So if you get a chance and Google that, it's out there somewhere, and you can see what they did in the aftermath of a lot of them completely unexpected, like the Boston Marathon bombers. You know, what happened during that and how they were impacted by that.
One question to Natalie from Nuzha Shakroun from Tunisia. What's the lifespan of cryotanks?
Good question. I think it's probably a question for another topic for I3, which is cryo storage. Look, we have a rule that certainly though the small dewars that are moved around and banged around under benches and things, certainly no more than 10 years because of the movement and the potential loss of the vacuum there. The larger vapor phase tanks, which we're moving to because of the huge amount of material in cryo storage. We're actually working through that at the moment. The suppliers of those tanks say a 10-year lifespan of product as well, but we also have to look at how we use those tanks. They're more reliant on the controllers themselves. So we certainly rigorously maintain those and get the servicing done when it's required. But yeah, we're still in discussion with the business and our insurance company as to how long those tanks, the large vapor phase tanks, can actually be in use for. Because they're expensive. They're certainly 40,000, 50,000 Australian dollars. And it's also very difficult to sort of, do a move over and retire a tank when it's working perfectly fine.
Agreed. I think that's a question that still needs a little more information to be answered in this industry. So a question from Kelly Tillman, quality management queen from Ghent, fellow quality management lover. So does your emergency kit have X amount of vitrification kits so you have enough medium to vitrify your zygotes and embryos? I know I'll jump in and say that when hurricane season is getting ready to hit in Louisiana, and same with tornado season in the summer, we have on our list to make sure that we order double of what we typically do for vitrification kits. Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, actually, that was a question that I was going to discuss because we got into hurricane season, and then so I reminded the team, and I think I scared them a little bit, but I sent out a message about hurricane preparedness and to make sure that they ordered kits and had flashlights and checked all of the emergency binders. And then immediately I got messages, is there a hurricane coming? But I wanted them to start working on it before the hurricanes were going to come. But yeah, we always stock up on extra vit media during hurricane season.
Yeah, and good point about the flashlights. Check the batteries in your flashlights. Make sure you got flashlights and lanterns. And like as Michael Baker was saying in the video, extension cords. We ran into an issue in Michigan. We didn't have long enough extension cords to feed the generators that were outside, the portable ones, into the lab. So lots of forward thinking. You got to think through everything.
One question from Mehtab Nizamani to Dr. Ivani. In case of CO2 failure, safety of culturing in HEPAs and MOPS, what's the duration? For how long can we culture in HEPAs and MOPS in a transporter incubator?
I would definitely look toward vitrification of everything I could. Obviously if the incubators aren't open, again, it depends on what type of incubators you have. But this gets back to my point about, when are you going to call it that this is an emergency and we have to do this? For example, and, we have a plan that we're going to move everything to these incubators over here in the corner and we shut these down. So you're not using as much CO2 or gas, whatever your gas mix might be. And so if you have that luxury in your lab of not all the incubators are always full all the time, you can centralize things into 2 or 3 incubators, and that's going to drastically cut down on the amount of CO2 that you're using. And then from there, I would move right into vitrification. I would not try to extend or culture overnight. I think in a short-term situation, it might work, but I would not try to do it in a long-term situation.
So I have another question for you, Dr. Ivani. It says, how do you plan for a risk analysis and who is involved?
Well, again, I think to get, to utilize our resources that are out there, our federal, state, county resources, and look at what risks we are facing. Are you in an area where you might have more of a terrorist risk than or an active shooter risk than a hurricane? Identify the risk first, and then I think pulling, using the concept of teaming where you're pulling people together and putting out ideas so you can try to cover all the bases, whether it's financial, operations. But I think to ignore this, we need to learn from what all of our colleagues have been through. And I think lab people don't sleep at night because they worry about, did I inseminate the eggs? Did I, add liquid nitrogen? And so we as lab people might be the ones that initiate these conversations. And I think you just have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. But also to learn from our colleagues, learn from other resources that are out there is really a great place to start.
Thank you.
So a general question for anyone to jump in on from Megan Ainsworth. Does anyone have experience with active participation and involvement of emergency services with planning and maybe practicing drills for these emergency situations that may arise? Do they have an agreed action plan to be enacted as necessary with the clinic and an understanding of what is in the clinic? Anyone have any experience?
I can talk a little bit about that. So certainly our larger lab, we have a lot of embryologists who are very passionate about this because they've gone through fires and things. So one of them asked me, are we allowed to go in and flick breaker switches and turn off external air supply and sort of mess around with the air conditioning and things. So we have had some basic discussions around whether or not the lab staff should be involved in some of those basic things. But at this moment in time, the business itself is not keen for that to happen. Obviously, power supply and air conditioning supply is, it's complex, especially in high-rise buildings. And we do what we do best and leave those areas to the specialists. So we have a very good relationship with our key people that supply all of these, and they understand the business that we do. And so that's probably an important thing as well, is to really build a relationship with your key suppliers for emergency systems, power and air conditioning, so they understand what it is you do and how essential it is for their response time.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that, if you're in a big building or in a hospital, you need to make sure that the person who is responsible for building services knows about your IVF lab and what's going on. We have in a previous hurricane, they knew we were there. However, they were going to shut off the generator to that entire building to conserve power for the main part of the hospital. And we sort of got wind of it by accident, so we had we contacted them and we had a few hours to go in and freeze the embryos, but it was just a mistake of communication from someone else in the hospital. So you need to confirm that, because we thought that they did know. But then as far as emergency professionals, in your area, they are trained to deal with natural disasters and putting together teams for emergencies. So reach out to your local officials and ask who the best disaster planning person is. I know in Louisiana, I believe the fire department is the central organizer of any disaster organizations.
I was just going to add one more thing that we do a fair bit of, that our suppliers and contractors, we often offer a lab tour. There's nothing that hits home more than, I guess, taking people through and what we do and actually seeing firsthand, especially if you've got time-lapse incubators and you can sort of show a patient's embryos growing. It really does hit home about how important it is for them to be responsive and understand what we do and you know how important it is.
Yeah. And again, echoing, I think what was already said, establishing relationships. For example, our gas suppliers love us. We buy them Christmas presents, have to make sure to keep them on our good side, because they know if they get an order for our lab that, you know, we need to be the first stop, or we've gotten some hotshot deliveries in the middle of the night, or like on a Sunday, and they're more than happy to do it because they know what we're doing for people in the community.
Question for Dr. Katz. So, are there any insurance plans for reimbursement of cycle fees if a cycle stopped, canceled, or adversely affected?
Yeah, I think that would fall under loss of business income. And so I do think there is a policy potential for that. So I would have that clinic look into it. Again, loss of business income, and that income could be used for many different things. So I think that is an opportunity.
All right. Well, it's been a really great session. So I think Fadi's going to go ahead and wrap it up for us.
Thank you, Chelsey. So we would like to thank all who took part in this webinar, my co-hosts, Tricia Adams, Dr. Chelsey Leisinger, and presenters Natalie Hesketh, Dr. Kristen Ivani, and Dr. Steve Katz, and of course, all who helped to produce the video clips of real-life experiences.
And not forgetting our team from I3. Thanks to the organizing committee of this initiative, I3, who are Jacques Cohen, Peter Nagy, Marianne Civites, I'm sorry if I mispronounced, Civites there, Thomas Elliott, Fran Farley, Giles Palmer, and Violetta Sora.
And our next session is on November 7th. It's all about assisted reproduction in Africa, an I3 special assignment. So be sure to tune in November. And until then, everyone stay safe and keep disaster planning at the forehand. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.